Good afternoon. It's truly wonderful to see you all, and really, I can attest, having come here about 15 years ago, that this group has grown. It's amazing to watch the growth. I especially want to thank AAC&U and Tia for giving me the honor to speak on this important occasion. We are here today to draw strength from the diversity of the people gathered here, that's all of us here, with all the differences in our life experiences, our perspectives, and our professional expertise. Some among us are trained as mathematicians, others as sociologists or higher ed professionals. I was trained as an economist. And allow me to confess, I'm a little jealous of your fields. After just one paragraph written by Thomas Carlyle 169 years ago, my colleagues and I are stuck with the moniker as the practitioner of the dismal science. And that moniker is really not helpful for your social life. And yet, what was so dismal about economics? The problem with Carlyle was that he wanted to maintain the plantation system in the West Indies. And the principles of economics gave him no help in justifying the continued oppression of people of color. Those principles argued instead for a free and trained workforce receiving a living wage. To Carlyle, that was dismal news. And so, in the spirit of rebellion against counsels of despair and labels that stick forever, I want to begin with two hopeful notes. One, Americans celebrate diversity more fervently than any people on earth. It's hard to believe, but it's true. I think it speaks more for the other countries than us, but okay, go with this. In 2016, the Pew Research Center asked people in a dozen developed nations whether growing diversity made their countries a better place to live or not. 58% of Americans said yes, which was more than 20 points higher than the most positive response in any European nation. Before you begin murmuring about the current dynamics of race in our nation and what the poll today might say, consider that in the same study, again, 2016 study, self-identified conservatives in America proved to be vastly more positive about diversity than self-identified liberals in Europe. Okay. So here's the message, I think. Conflict and controversy sells newspapers. Conflict and controversy generate clicks. But we should not lose sight of the consensus that binds us. Two, we have gotten through this before. Many observers bemoan the state of public discourse, including discourse on our campuses, as little more than shouting matches and personal attacks. But our society has survived previous periods when some were quick to substitute vilification for reasoning or name-calling for debate. In 1972, in an essay he titled "The Diatribe, Last Resort for Protests," the rhetorician Theodore Wint wrote about the tendency to shout for the sake of shouting, to shock for the sake of shocking. People who engaged in such diatribes, he wrote, were driven by a sense of hopelessness, the conviction that if they advanced reasoned arguments, their opponents won't listen. And this hopelessness became a self-fulfilling, self-defeating prophecy when the other side responded in kind. So that instead of political debate, there was only a reciprocated diatribe. This was 1972 when he wrote this. I mention this because what Wint was writing about was the Vietnam anti-war protests of the Yippies, also known sometimes as the Crazies. Many of those crazies ended up as university administrators today. You've probably met a few of them in your cabinet meetings, where you've heard them vent about these young people today, and what do they do? So yes, we have gotten through this before. I hope you will keep that in mind as I ask you to join me in grappling with one of the most difficult, complex, and contentious issues that we face in academic life. And that is the question, how may we argue with one another? And I didn't use the word dialogue. I could use that word because argumentation is a field of study, right? That's what communication studies was based on, was the art of argumentation. I want to consider how we as faculty and administrators may respond to controversy and how we can best manage the problems that often surround a controversy. Problems of legal rights and responsibilities, safety and security on campus, and allocation of budget resources. Not least, the very real matter of the emotional life of our students. That's the most important thing. I also want to touch on the most intractable problem of all, how we may proceed when people do not want to argue, when they are determined to provoke, but have no intentions to discuss anything with the people they have addressed their words to and addressed their words against. Every faculty member in this country and every administrator will confront these issues sooner or later. But those of us gathered at this luncheon today, for faculty and administrators of color, the questions are all the more pressing. I believe our experience has given us an especially useful perspective on these questions, a perspective that may be clarifying for others in the field. That perspective, I propose, comes from a deep understanding that the controversies that so preoccupy us today are about more than a core value of the academy and of democratic society. They are, in fact, about two core values that have recently come into conflict. On the one hand, there is freedom of expression, which is the foundation of all academic life. Free speech is what enables our students to pursue knowledge, to learn, and to grow by discussing subjects of all kinds, including the most troubling. It is the heart of every college and university and the lifeblood of democratic self-governance. On the other hand, there is diversity and inclusion. Our institutions have evolved to the point where many of us have embraced diversity and inclusion in our core mission and value statements. My institution, Hollins University, has embraced that too. AACU, which revised its mission statement and reaffirmed its commitment to inclusive excellence in all its forms, is another example. I don't want to sound naive. I know there are substantial pockets of resistance we face. But for the great majority of Americans today, as I've mentioned, it has become self-evident that our society cannot exclude any group of citizens and still consider itself a democracy. We must be inclusive. And for the great majority of people in our colleges and universities, it's also self-evident that an academic community that is not diverse will inevitably be superficial in its ideas. That a college or university that fails to include certain groups will also shut out a world of thoughts and experiences. Freedom of expression on the one hand, diversity and inclusion on the other. What happens when these two come into conflict? As faculty and administrators of color, we perhaps are a little more alert than others to the implications of this clash. We know it's particularly powerful and disturbing. If you doubt me, then let's try this thought experiment. Imagine a clash between free speech and a different core value. For example, what if a speaker came to campus and aroused animosity by campaigning against the theory of evolution, or certainly that human activity is causing climate change? This too would be a conflict of values, between freedom of expression and adherence to evidence-based reasoning. But we know very well that a clash like that would not hit a raw nerve. The nerve is touched when the matter is of one's identity, particularly those identities that are deeply embedded and not chosen: race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender, and one's immigration status. It's one thing for a speaker to belittle or dismiss someone's chosen position about climate change or economic policy. It's something else entirely for a speaker to belittle or dismiss someone's identity. Now, exclusion is at the forefront. Now it gets personal. Let me give you an example from my own experience when I was at Augustana College. It happened during the long presidential campaign of 2016. Students, faculty, and staff awoke one morning to find that the entire campus had been covered with political slogans: build the wall, feminism is cancer, Hillary for prison, and of course, Trump 2016. The slogans were all around. Every sidewalk had these slogans, all over the place. Simple pieces of chalk. If you're like me, you might remember spending many happy hours as a child drawing on the sidewalk with chalk. The chalk gave us an outlet for our imagination and the means to play games such as hopscotch and tic-tac-toe. But this was a completely different kind of game. Who would have thought that an innocent piece of chalk, a child's most basic toy, could become a tool to provoke, to attack, and yes, to hurt? As it later turned out, there was an irony here. Some of the students who had chalked, and when I had conversations with them, told us they chalked at night. They had chalked probably the entire night. There was that much chalking, because they were afraid to voice support for their candidate in broad daylight for fear of ridicule and marginalization. You see how knowingly or inadvertently we have shut down conversations on topics with which we may disagree. There's a lot more I can say about that, but I don't want to go on that tangent. Nevertheless, the fact remained that many students in our community felt threatened when they found themselves surrounded by these slogans written in the middle of the night. By their omnipresence, the chalkings caused genuine anguish. The student who felt affected held protest meetings and demanded an immediate response from the administration. They wanted us to issue a condemnation of the sidewalk messages and take action against whoever was responsible. Suddenly, we were embroiled in a dilemma that other colleges and universities across the nation were facing. Some people would have said it's the dilemma about whether there should be limits to free expression on campus. Some of us saw it otherwise. We saw it as a dilemma about the limits on free expression when speech comes into conflict with the right of students to feel that they belong at our institutions. A sense of belonging. That is perhaps the key to the value of diversity and inclusion. Over the past quarter of a century, higher education has looked closely at the fortunes of students of color on our campuses. We have looked at retention rates, graduation rates. We have looked at student experiences on our campuses and participation in academic enrichment opportunities. We have seen that students of color come to our schools and have a different experience than our white students, which impacts outcomes. And we have learned that we need to be honest about the specificity of those experiences. As a result, we have started to have serious conversations about what it would take for students of color to have a similar sense of belonging on campus as our white students. We still have a long way to go, but I can say our field has recognized the issue and we are working hard to close the gap. What that means in immediate personal terms is that when students come back to our campuses after being away on a break, we often say, "Welcome home." So back to my story. So how can we break our word to our students? I think it's entirely legitimate for students of color to say, if this is truly my home, then why can't I feel safe and respected within its walls? How is it tolerable that I should be assaulted by hateful messages within my own home? It's a legitimate question. In such situations, there are people nowadays who are quick to complain that our students have become too soft, too spoiled, coddled, special snowflakes. But let me tell you, I could see that these students were hurt and some were in shock. I could not discount their feelings. To be transparent, I was disturbed myself. Those words stung me too. But we administrators must act on principle and accept the emotional toll of the job, even as we explain our decisions to different groups and ironically leave no one feeling satisfied. The fact remained, our administration could not satisfy student demands for legal action. As difficult as it were, we had to explain that there are different kinds of threats. And while the aggressive, hurtful words scrawled all around campus felt threatening, they did not constitute what the law considers to be material threat or imminent physical danger. You can imagine how that went. The students did not want to hear this legalistic response. So what could we do for them? First, we asserted the right of our college to enforce our student code of conduct. Our institutions all have the authority to establish rules of behavior. Public colleges and universities, of course, have far less leeway than private schools. But students elect to go to our colleges and universities, and by choosing to do so, they agree to abide by the standards of their new community. So we said, we have rules against plastering flyers over every surface on campus. It's simply not allowed. Let's apply the same rule to political sloganeering, or what some claimed was hate speech that was chalked into the sidewalk. We cannot ban people from chalking an endorsement for one political candidate or a nasty message about another. But you just simply can't bombard us with these messages wherever we go. So we established a place where it was all right to chalk, just as there are places where it's all right to hang flyers and posters. That was the first step. We used our code of conduct and student handbook. Then for the second step, I made a misstep. I can laugh about it now in retrospect, but it was not funny at that time. When we made our decision, I sent an email to the whole college explaining how things were going to work. I should have said, we are going to establish a free chalking zone on campus. In my haste, I wrote a free speech zone. After I had sent that email, I sent another one to correct it. But the damage had been done. People who wanted to score political points were already sending out blog posts with a screenshot of my campus email complaining that free speech had been fenced in at Augustana College. I was being pushed for an immediate response by students who were distraught. But nevertheless, I should have used better judgment. I'd like to think I've learned from that mistake, and I want to share that lesson with you. And all of you know this, don't hit send. Right? Wait a little bit. I know you're anxious to get the message out, but just wait. The political price one had to pay, and the mails and emails and hate mails one got after this message went out took a toll. And then there's a third thing that happened, and this is regarding a similar thing but a different matter. When the opportunity arose, we engaged with our college Republicans through their advisor. It happened that the college Republicans decided they wanted to invite the former Breitbart editor, Milo Yiannopoulos, to speak on campus in late spring, early fall 2016. So this is before Milo's fall from grace, but it was still an issue. Fortunately, all invitations had to be reviewed by the administration. There's the handbook that came in handy again. We fretted and debated and did not just rubber stamp this particular invitation. We asked the student leaders to come in for a conversation. We said as a college, we will not prevent Milo from speaking, but we want to know, what teaching purpose do you believe will be served by bringing him here? What will he contribute to academic discourse on this campus? And how likely is it that he will persuade other students to adopt your point of view? If you truly believe in the positions you are promoting, then why not bring in a speaker who's not just a flamethrower? Why not bring in someone who is capable in open discussion of winning hearts and minds? And the college Republicans responded, you know, you're right. Imagine that. We engaged them in a conversation before they brought in an inflammatory speaker. And as a result, our community managed to head off what could have been a big problem. What we did was nothing unique. And I realized that we were really fortunate or just plain lucky. However, this approach to resolving the conflict between free speech and inclusiveness can be found on other campuses. Drake University, for example, created a statement of principles that mentioned certain reasonable restrictions, the things that students could not do, but mostly focused on positive things, what students, faculty, and staff should do regarding free speech, academic freedom, and civil discourse. This statement of principles proved its worth when a nationally known hate group announced that it intended to visit Drake to protest against the university's symposium on same-sex marriage. The president at that time, David Maxwell, sent a message to the campus, reminding everyone that the university is a place where people should be able to debate critical issues without fear of reprisal. But in the spirit of the statement of principles, he also asked the Drake community to show that it could act with dignity and restraint in the face of provocation. The result? Members of the campus community exercised their right to assemble and speak by holding a counter-protest that was peaceful, positive in spirit, and very effective in showing the hate group that there was no profit for them in being around. The hate group exercised its own right to free speech, then quickly left without incident. Again, this may not work in many situations, but one still needs to plan ahead and develop a statement of principles. How do you make an effective statement of principles? I suggest 4 components as a start. Keep it short and simple so it can be understood. Do not have your lawyers write it. Keep it inclusive so that people realize the campus community is not divided into us and them. It's always us and the other us. Keep it up to date so that it covers changing situations and landscape. Review it every semester. And above all, keep it in practice. Model those principles. Principles need to be lived every day by every single one of us. If we don't apply these principles on a daily basis, they only become things we pull out in times of emergency. And then it just seems like Band-Aid. The advantage of this approach is that it preserves free speech while making it clear to everyone that not all forms of behavior can be excused on First Amendment grounds. Indeed, there are constitutional limits to campus speech codes. But if codes of conduct are drafted appropriately, if they take care to maintain a diversity of opinions just as we respect the need for diversity of people, then it is possible for campuses to create safe spaces for our historically marginalized students. without the principles of free expression being outraged. Our students are constantly learning, and we can't expect them to know on their first try how to speak and interact in constructive ways that honor the principle of community. This is another reason why a statement of principle can be valuable, and why inclusive, safe spaces, trigger warnings, and rules against microaggressions may be appropriate educational tools. They can help preserve an environment that allows for greater learning, as long as we do the work on the other end of making our students ready to face uncomfortable, disturbing, or even hateful environments once they leave our campuses. Debate, disagreement, and controversy are often when the best learning happens, but we need to manage that well. We do well to remember that our educational missions are part of an ongoing process intended to result in graduates more capable of navigating the world than when they first entered our campuses. There is, of course, an argument to be made that our students need a little rough and tumble in their discourse on campus. I agree. Our students need to explore and get ready for a world that often isn't so nice. You could say that safe spaces, trigger warnings, and rules against microaggression delay the process. Or on the other hand, I would argue that these accommodations can help establish the sense of belonging, the atmosphere of care, confidence, and self-worth that enable our students to explore and grow and ultimately thrive in the world that awaits them. There must be a balance between support and challenge. One thing is certain, however. We must be creative and sensitive in resolving the clash between free speech and inclusiveness. If we fail in achieving this resolution, the very basis of academic life may be undermined. A recent survey by Brookings Institution found that fewer than half of American students understand that hate speech is constitutionally protected. A majority erroneously believe that schools are required by the First Amendment to present an opposing viewpoint to a controversial speaker. And an alarmingly high number feel it is appropriate to shout down speakers whom they oppose or even use violence to silence them. As faculty and administrators of color, we ought to be alarmed by these statistics. Think about which groups historically have most often been shouted down or told by authorities that their opinions have strayed beyond acceptable boundaries. We should be the very first people to defend freedom of expression against encroachment. But we must also be resolute in upholding the value of inclusiveness, because as we have seen, attacks on inclusiveness is what has corroded our students' confidence in free speech. They are, in fact, among the reasons why so many young people today not only fail to support one another's right to free speech, but fail to understand our bedrock First Amendment rights. It takes patience, calm, and perseverance to resolve conflicts between free speech and inclusiveness. Very often, the day after you've done it, you have to get up and do it all over again. But no one ever told us this was going to be easy. If we understand why it is so crucial for us to do this work and maintain both values, if we get out ahead of potential problems and take the initiative in holding frank, purpose-driven conversations with all who live and work on our campuses, and above all, if we trust in our communities enough to hold them to their own high standards of conduct, then day by day, we will succeed in helping to make all our students feel that they belong, and make our students passionate advocates and practitioners of free speech and an inclusive campus and an inclusive world. This work will take a toll on us as people of color. It's cultural taxation. We will sometimes have to push the personal aside, but we can do this. I would argue we must do this. With clarity in our minds, faith in our students, and support from one another. We will. When worn down, I want us to remind ourselves that the work that we do is, after all, for the next generation, our young ones. Thank you. The question was that what happens if a speaker is sponsored by an outside group? So there's nobody to have a conversation with, which was in our case. And again, different schools have different policies, so I would recommend revisit your policy. Our policy requires that a campus group must sponsor any outside speaker. So in our case, they would, and we do require permission through their advisor that comes up to, at least at Augustana, through the provost office. And so there was a way in which we could engage in dialogue. So sometimes rules and policies can be your friend. So use them in your favor. Any other questions? Yeah. No, it's a great question, and I wish I had an answer, right? I'd be writing the next book about how to. But I think it's, again, what you do is it's a case-by-case, situation-by-situation is contextual. So it's not one answer that will fit every institution based on who you are and where this is happening. If it's in a classroom context, right, there are ways in which one can approach this issue differently. Again, depending on if it's the faculty member who's the one who's making this argument, one can have conversations. And again, if our goal is student learning, right, which is what it should be for many of our institutions, if student learning, how does this help student learning? Right? That's the question I always ask, even with trigger warnings where people are so opposed to it and philosophically opposed to it. And the question then that I often ask is, if our goal is for our students to learn and be the best they can be, and this is how they cope, is via trigger warning, then let's help them learn. Let's help them cope. So in the same situation, depending on what the issue was, is there a way that if student learning becomes the core goal, could we have conversations around that and find the best way? It's not that, I'm not saying to our faculty that we don't have to have that particular reading read, right? But how do we make it so that students learn from the process? Hopefully that answers part of it, but perhaps not at a different scale if it's, not in a classroom setting. Becomes tougher. No, great question. I would say the word safe spaces has been misused all over the place. I would ask, so if we have an Asian student house or a black student house, right, that's a different space for students that have been created. Right? Now, there'll be some faculty who say, my classroom is a safe space. One needs clarification. What does that mean? It's a safe space where any ideas can come forth and nobody will attack the person. Often that's what they mean. It's not a safe space where we can't ask questions that are challenging questions. So I think we need to first be certain, what is it that we are talking about when we use the term safe space, right? Is it an intellectual safe space, or is it a physical safe space where students can go and just let their hair down and just be themselves in an environment that sometimes does not feel as friendly, right? So I'm not sure if I answered your question, but I think once we parse that out, then we can have deeper conversations and what does that mean? All right. Thank you.
Well, thank you for joining us this afternoon. We look forward to next year. The next session starts, Dawn, I believe, at 1:30. At 1:30. Thank you, Pareena, so much. Enjoy your afternoon.